Let's start at the beginning. So I'm Kristin Dziczek. I'm a vice president at the Center for Automotive Research. We're a nonprofit organization in Ann Arbor that studies the global automotive industry. And I know some of you aren't auto. So you're thinking, why do I care what the Center for Automotive Research has to say? How many of you were in business in Michigan in 2008 and 2009? How many of you business was going great in 2008 and 2009? Many fewer people. In our research, in my research prior to coming to the Center for Automotive Research, we find that you cannot grow virtually anything in the state of Michigan if you don't have a strong auto industry. And NAFTA poses a very big threat to our strong auto industry in the state. So that's why I think this is an important thing for you to talk about. A little bit of background on NAFTA. It came about in 1994. It eliminated tariffs and created this unified trading region, one of the biggest trading regions in the world. Canada and Mexico are responsible for half of the vehicles sold, imported vehicles sold in the United States. So if it's an import, half the time it comes from Canada or Mexico, and oftentimes that comes with a brand that you think of as an American car. And NAFTA makes us a globally competitive and complete auto region where we are able to distribute the work according to each country's best abilities and to where it is the best cost to do that work, all in one region. Many globally competitive auto regions have a low-cost component. If you look in Europe, you're looking to Slovenia and Slovakia and Poland. If you're in Asia, you're looking to China and Thailand and India. If you're in North America, you're looking to Mexico. So every global automotive region relies on low-cost content, and that's necessary for a competitive industry globally. The United States automotive industry, we sell 17.3 million vehicles. We make 11, so we really can't satisfy market demand with what we're making right now. We export 2.4 million of those vehicles, and we import another 8.7 million vehicles. So together with our exports and our imports, we get to that 17.3 from our $11 million in production. We have about 12 million units of productive capacity in the United States. This is the sourcing of our light vehicle sales in 2017. You see that US-based firms, and for that I'm counting FCA, Ford, General Motors, and Tesla, are almost 31% of the vehicles sold in the United States that were made in the United States. International firms that make their vehicles here, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, many others, account for about 1 in 4 vehicles for their production here in the US. This rest of the production, the 44% of imports, could be any nameplate. Could be a Detroit 3 brand, could be any nameplate but Tesla, actually, because they're the only ones who produce only in the United States. Canada and Mexico and Japan each count for 11% of the share of sales in the United States. Our forecast for light vehicle sales in the United States is a very nice plateau, getting back up above where we were in 2016. 2016 was a peak at 17.5. We've kind of fallen off of that a little bit, but if all other things held equal, we see some slow growth coming back in our sales here in the United States. Mexico and Canada have auto sales too, but no matter what we do, they don't change. They're always the same amount. So if you look at North American sales, it follows the US sales trend. Now the balance of trade between the United States and Canada and US and Mexico in motor vehicle and parts. With Canada, we're pretty balanced. We have a little bit of a deficit. With Mexico, we have a growing deficit. And certainly the president is very focused on eliminating bilateral trade deficits. I have a bilateral trade deficit with my grocery store. I give them money, they give me food. I don't sell them food. We're not trading in the same thing. They don't buy automotive research. That's what I'm good at. They don't care. So there's a lot of reasons why you might have a bilateral trade deficit with one market or one country. So this focus on balancing trade with every one of your trade partners in every product is a little goofy, to say nicely. The competitive auto industry is very good for US consumers. This is the CPI going back to 1994 when NAFTA was first introduced. The CPI for all items except for food and energy, and then the CPI for new vehicles. The CPI for new vehicles has barely gone anywhere. And I know you think when you go to buy a new car, the price has gone up a little bit. But in relationship to everything else that we're buying, the price of vehicles has not moved very much at all since 1994. And this comes from our friend Ann Wilson, who regrets not being able to be here, and it's the whole reason I'm here. But one of her slides was about how vehicle parts are traded. So this story is a company in Grand Rapids, Michigan that buys a capacitor from a company in Centennial, Colorado called Arrow Electronics, which imports those components from multiple suppliers in Asia. So that's, one, it's coming in from Asia and somebody in Grand Rapids is buying it. Then they ship it to Mexico and it's inserted into a circuit board. And then it goes to El Paso to avoid some taxes and for temporary importation into Mexico. And then it returns to Kongsberg Automotive, a factory in Matamoros, also in Mexico. Kongsberg, a Norwegian company, assembles the circuit board into a seat actuator. And once that circuit board has been installed in the actuator, the control unit ships to a number of sites, including the Lear Corporation seat manufacturing plant in Arlington, Texas, a Magna seat plant in Mississauga, Ontario, and many other locations across the North American automotive production supply chain. So traveling inside that finished seat, the capacitor is then shipped a very short distance to the auto assembly plant. Seats are something that I consider in the dust cloud, like, Pigpen had that little dust cloud that went around him. When an auto assembly plant sits down, there's a whole bunch of things that must be right next to it, either because the thing is too fragile, too bulky, or too heavy to ship long distances, and seats are one of them. So these seats don't go very far, but they will be installed in the Ford Flex in Toronto suburb of Oakville, in GM's Escalades, Suburbans, Tahoes, Yukons in Arlington, Texas. So that little capacitor went a long, long way, and it crossed the border a couple of times. And free trade within the North American region allows them to cross that border multiple times without increasing the price along the way. So the U.S. has a proposal. This is as the proposal stood last Friday. They began negotiations yesterday. As far as I know, the U.S., the only thing they've added is that they want a 5-year sunset clause, and I will address that if I remember to come back to that. The Mexicans are putting forth a proposal today, but the overview of their proposal is they're increasing regional value content from 62.5%, which is currently the highest regional value content, or the value that has to be done in North America in order for it to qualify for free trade. It's the highest of any free trade agreement the U.S. has. They instituted a regional value content percentage for steel and aluminum content, and they instituted a labor value content requirement for a share of work that has to be done at or above a specified wage. Now I'm going to go into a little bit more details, but just kind of skim over them because, I love this stuff, but you don't necessarily. The regional value content includes light and medium duty vehicles. That's a change. Right now, NAFTA auto rules only pertain to light duty vehicles in the section that we're talking about. They're going to increase the 62.5 to 75% over 4 years for cars and 2 years for pickup trucks. Electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles get a longer grow-in, about 9 years, and that includes advanced batteries. Much of that electronics content is not made in the North American region, and we don't have the capacity to make it in the North American region. So 9 years is an aggressive time frame to build up an industry that we don't have right now. It's a 4-year for all transition for all parts categories, and there's 3 different categories of parts. Core parts are basically engines and transmissions, and then they have 2 other categories. Steel and aluminum is requiring at least 70% North American sourced steel and aluminum for the total value of these automakers' steel and aluminum purchase. Canada and Mexico are currently exempt from the steel and aluminum tariffs that come about from the Section 232 investigation, but that could change. The administration is sort of holding that over their head, that they'll put that tariff back on the steel and aluminum. Canada is the #1 source of steel and aluminum to the United States, and Mexico is in the top 5 for steel. And then this labor value content. So a share of the vehicle's content must be made in a country where the labor earns at least $15 to $16 an hour. So that's basically a peg that says it must come from US or Canada, because there's nobody making $15 or $16 an hour working in manufacturing in the auto industry in Mexico. There are provisions that allow them to spend on salaries for R&D, and that counts toward the labor value content, but this is basically a peg inside the NAFTA rules for auto that says you must make this much of the vehicle inside a country making $15 to $16 an hour, or the US and Canada. The interesting thing is the US sells itself, out of that 11 million vehicles we make, about 80% of them don't leave the country for some vehicles that are made here. Pickup trucks being one of them. The pickup trucks that we make here, we largely sell here. Sell a few in Canada, a few in Mexico, a few go to Russia or Saudi Arabia, but go around the rest of the world, there's not a lot of people driving big pickup trucks. That's a US or North American product. If you make it here and it doesn't cross the border, you don't have to comply with any of this NAFTA stuff. If it's not going to be traded, you can have any labor content or steel and aluminum content or regional value content you want if you're not trading it across the border. And not everything traded in our region currently uses the NAFTA preferential rates. So right now, and I'm going to call out motor vehicle parts, 84% of the parts that come from Canada and 77% of the parts that come from Mexico are claiming the NAFTA preference. And that means almost 1 in 5, a value of 1 in 5 of the parts imports to the United States from Canada or Mexico is not claiming the NAFTA preference for some reason. And it may be that they can't make the 62.5% threshold already. And it's more advantageous for them to pay the tariff of 2.5% on their parts imports for 20% of their imports to the United States. So if the cost of all of this stuff costs more than 2.5% to comply with, it's cheaper to pay the tariff of 2.5%. And we offer the 2.5% tariff rate to all of our most favored nation trading partners. Those are all the members of the WTO. It's 2.5% on cars and most parts, and due to a weird thing that goes back to 1963, it's 25% tariff on pickup trucks and cargo vehicles. And if there's one thing that's very interesting about all of this is that you set a very high tariff, like 25%. You think have high standards, that's going to get you very high content. Well, people are very creative in getting around this 25% for pickups and cargo vehicles. Some of the first truck imports under this tariff were sent in without a bed. So it wasn't a cargo vehicle. If it doesn't have a bed, there's no place to put anything in it. Some vehicles came along. Anybody remember the Subaru Brat? Looked like sort of a little El Camino, but had 2 seats in the back. It had 2 seats in the back. That made that a passenger vehicle and not a truck. There are vehicles that come in to our ports that come in with seats in the cargo van, and they take those seats out and throw them away and sell it as a cargo van here. So tariff engineering, those people can be very, very creative, and they have been for these very high tariffs like the one we have on pickup trucks. We have a lot of parts that come to the United States from many different countries. So Mexico and Canada, for most subsystems of the vehicle, are our number 1 and 2 importers of vehicle parts for each one of these sections. But the next 3, so this is the top 5, including Mexico and Canada, are not far behind. So if you look in, for instance, in transmission and powertrain parts, Japan outstrips Canada. And of course, in electrical and electronic, China, Japan, and Taiwan all import more than Canada does. We have a lot of steering and suspension parts coming from Japan, and China is very close to what we're getting from Canada. And metal stampings, a lot come from Taiwan and South Korea. And other motor vehicle parts, China, 18% of our other motor vehicle parts by category. So if we don't get things from Mexico or Canada, we can get it from a lot of other places. If we're paying 2.5% on the imports from Mexico or Canada, and it's cheaper to do it in China or Taiwan or South Korea or Japan, or certainly not going to be cheaper in Germany, but if it's cheaper from any one of these other countries or the other 100 or so countries we get these parts from, they'll go there and they'll import that and pay the 2.5%. So that 2.5% threshold is really very low, and a lot of what is proposed in NAFTA is going to cost a lot more than that to comply with. So we did a study, put it out, I think 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago. I don't know, it was kind of a big rush. And we found that about 22 and as many as 40 vehicle nameplates that are currently qualifying for NAFTA would not qualify under the U.S. proposal. So we calculated that that would add about $2.1 to $3.8 billion to the cost of light vehicles in the United States, an average of about $500 to $2,200 per vehicle, and that assuming manufacturers passed all of those higher costs along to their consumers, we'd see 60,000 to 150,000 lost light vehicle sales at least. And that's almost an entire manufacturing plant or assembly plant, but it's spread out across, of course, a number of manufacturers. One of the big sticking points is the timeline and the phase-in. 2, 3, 4-year transition periods are wholly inadequate. The minimum time it takes from the time you've decided you're going to make an assembly plant is 3 years before you've launched production and have that vehicle out for sale in showrooms. At least 3 years, and that's once you've decided. It takes a while to decide these things inside corporations, so it's well longer than 3 years to go from we think we might need some capacity to when we do need capacity. Adjusting and resourcing the supply chain also takes time, and suppliers also need that lead time in order to build out new capacity they may need to support. And all of this costs less than the 2.5% MFN tariff. I want to make one big point, and that is we have what is peak demand in 2016, and we're kind of creeping up a little bit above that to 17.8, 17.9 in our forecast. If you can meet peak demand with existing capacity, and a new plant costs $1 billion to $1.6 billion, are you going to add more capacity? And lots of you were around in 2008 and 2009. You remember what overcapacity did to our industry. They're very, very trigger shy or gun shy to going for more capacity in the United States based on something that may not be, we don't yet know where this is all going to land. And then that sunset period, which I did remember to get back to, the Trump administration would like to put in a 5-year review clause where the agreement would automatically terminate if there wasn't a new agreement agreed to or revisions or reaffirming the NAFTA agreement. Now, it's true that the NAFTA agreement got kind of stale on the vine, and some of the things that they were tracing before are not even in cars anymore, so it needed modernization. But if every 5 years that deal could fundamentally change, how does that give the auto industry certainty to make those $1.5 billion size investments and know that that's going to be there for 40 or 50 years in the productive capacity? So that introduces a lot of risk into an industry that doesn't like risk. So, the U.S. and Canada and Mexico have free trade reach beyond our own selves. The United States, we can reach, including our own market, which is the blue, Canada red, Mexico green, and then our remaining free trade agreements we have with Korea and others. We reach about 28% of the market for new vehicles without paying a tariff. Canada can reach 53% of the new market for new vehicles without tariff. And that got augmented by that yellow wedge, the CPTPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was just agreed to with all the partners except for the United States. Mexico can reach 51%, and their CPTPP wedge is a little smaller because they already had bilateral free trade agreements with many of the CPTPP members. So they're looking outward. There's been 9 of the last 12 new auto manufacturing plants have gone to Mexico. Right now, Mexico sends about 1 in 5 vehicles they make to a non-NAFTA market. In 2 years, it's going to be 1 in 3. They're facing away from us. They're looking at other markets for growth, and they're looking for other markets for stability and reducing the risk. So they can reach almost, a little over half, whereas we're only reaching ourselves and a little further beyond. This gets very political very fast, and if you looked at the little dust-up we had with Europe, they come back and say we're going to get at Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon, and they know where our political leaders live. These are the areas that get hit by motor vehicle and motor vehicle parts trade changes. Mexico is the #1 import trading partner with the United States. Mexico and Canada are. But we, in terms of volume and motor vehicle parts imports, we're #1 among these states. And in Canada, this is the parts of the country that are dependent on Canada for motor vehicle and parts imports. So, there's weird things like Louisiana gets imports for exports to Egypt, but for exports, that's what we're looking at. So we're export dependent to Canada, we're import dependent from Mexico. And that's where we get into how is this all going to land? And is there a plan B? I mean, we're seeing incredible brinksmanship in the NAFTA negotiations. They're talking right now, they think they could get a deal in 2 weeks. There's huge whole parts of the auto sector that isn't done. The dispute settlement provision is not done. Canada and Mexico will not budge on not having an international dispute settlement part of the agreement. And if we let this go on a little longer, we're running into, there's a provincial election over the border, south of here, in Ontario and in several other provinces in Canada. Ontario Parliament makes up 75% of the Canadian Parliament, and the current Liberal member who leads Ontario is running second or third in her re-election bid. So that could change the composition of the Parliament in Canada to making it difficult to ratify. Mexico gets brought up a lot. They have a presidential election coming up very soon, and the leading candidate there is very anti-American and hates Trump, and is not going to, even though he will be elected in just a little while, he doesn't take office until December. So they have to pass the NAFTA agreement through in a lame duck session if they are able to reach an agreement sometime before December. And of course, we have our own midterm elections here in the United States. And that could be very interesting since many of our Republican members of Congress are pro-free trade. So it's not entirely clear that the NAFTA agreement that this negotiation team and that the Trump administration brings back, even if they reach an agreement and bring it back to the Congress, that it will get ratified in advance of our midterm elections in November. So there's a lot to watch, a lot on the line, and a lot on the line for Michigan. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.